Python, we're going to be using SQLAlchemy, which is a very popular ORM that people use for different databases. Now, if you don't know what an ORM is, it stands for Object Relational Mapper, and basically it allows us to access our database in an easy-to-use object-oriented way. And the thing I like about it most is that you can use different databases without changing your Python code. So if you want to use an SQLite database for testing and a Postgres database for production, then all you need to do is pass in a different database URL for SQLAlchemy to connect to, but all of the code to query the database will be the same. And that's what we will be doing in this series. We'll use an SQLite database for development, and then when we're ready to deploy this application, we'll switch over to a Postgres database for production. So let's go ahead and get started so we can see what this looks like. So first of all, we need to install the Flask-SQLAlchemy package, and we can do that with a simple pip install. So we can say pip install, and that is Flask-SQLAlchemy. Now there is a regular SQLAlchemy package, but Flask-SQLAlchemy is a Flask-specific extension that provides some useful defaults and helpers for our Flask application. So let's use that one instead. So once that is installed, we can import this into our application. So I'm going to go back to our project file that we have open here in Sublime Text, and this file is called flaskblog.py for me. And at the top here, we can import this by saying from Flask_SQLAlchemy import SQLAlchemy, and that is uppercase there. So now let's copy that. And after we import that, then we need to specify the URI for the database, which is where the database is located. Now, we currently don't have a database, so let's just choose a location where we want this database to be. So for now, let's use an SQLite database because it's the easiest to get up and running with. And a SQLite database will simply be a file on our file system. So to set this location, we need to set this as a configuration. So we can say underneath our secret key here, we'll say app.config, and this is going to be equal to SQLAlchemy, and actually this is going to be all uppercase here. So SQLAlchemy underscore database underscore URI, and we'll set that equal to an empty string for now. Okay, so with SQLite, we can specify a relative path with 3 forward slashes in the URI. So we can say for this SQLite database, we can say SQLite and then a colon and then 3 forward slashes to specify a relative path. And then we'll just call this site.db. So these 3 slashes are a relative path from the current file. So that means that this site.db file should get created here in our project directory alongside our Python module that we're currently in. Okay, so now that we have that location set, now we need to create a database instance. And to do that, we can come up here right below our configurations and we can say db is equal to, and this will be equal to SQLAlchemy, and we're going to pass in the app as an argument to that. Okay, so now we have an SQLAlchemy database instance and are ready to work with our databases. Now, the great thing about SQLAlchemy is that we can represent our database structure as classes, and you'll be hearing those classes be called models. And doing the database structure this way is actually very intuitive after you get the hang of it. Now, we could put these classes into a separate file like we did with our forms, and we will do that in a later video in the series. But for now, I'm just going to put these within our main application because the imports can get a little weird with these dependencies if I was to separate them right now. So in the next video, we'll learn how to split these files up properly. But for now, let's go ahead and create those class models that will be our database structure. So each class is going to be its own table in the database. So first, let's create the user class to hold our users. And first, let me clean this up here. I'm going to separate this app from our imports and put all of this configuration and stuff together. And I will put the models right above our dummy post data. Okay, so to create this user model, I'm going to create a class and I'm going to call this user. And now we're going to import from db.model. And now within our user model, now we can add the columns for this table. So first we're going to have an ID, which is going to be a unique ID. And this is going to be equal to a db.column. And in the column, now we specify what type this is. So this is going to be an integer. So this will be db.integer. And this is also going to be our primary key, which just means that it is a unique ID for our user. So I'll say primary key is equal to true. Okay. And now we can move on to our next column. Our next column is going to be a username. So we'll set that equal to db.column. Now this username is going to be a string. So we can say db.string. And if you remember in our validation, I said that the max length of this is going to be 20 characters. So let's just put in a 20 there to say that it's a string of 20 characters. Now we want the usernames to be unique also. So we can pass in a unique attribute or a unique argument here. And we can say unique is equal to true. And also we have to have a username. So this can't be null. So we can say nullable is equal to false. Okay, so our email is going to be similar to our username column. So I'm just going to copy that and paste this in below here. Now for our email, let's just say that we don't want anything above 120 characters or so. We want these to be unique as well. So we'll say unique is equal to true and nullable equal to false. Now we're also going to have an image file. Now this is going to be for the user's profile pictures. So we will set this equal to a DB column as well. So I'm just going to copy and paste this one in here. So this will be a string, and I'm going to set 20 characters as the max here. And later in the video series, we'll see why, because we're going to hash these image files that are 20 characters long so that they are all unique. Now there's going to be a default profile picture that every user starts out with that is the same. So users aren't going to have unique profile pictures because sometimes they're going to be able to share those, like the default picture, for example. So I'll take away the unique is equal to true, and I'll keep this nullable is equal to false because they have to have at least the default image. And now let's set a default value here. So this is if we do not create the user with any specific profile image, then what is going to be the default? And we'll just set this equal to default.jpg. And that is something that we will add later in the series. Okay, so let's keep adding some columns here. Okay, so now let's add a password column because users are going to have passwords. And that's going to be equal to a DB column of type DB string, and I'll paste that in. Now the string for the passwords, again, these are going to be hashed. So the hashing algorithm that we're going to use is going to make this 60 characters long. So I'll do a 60 there, and we will again pass in a nullable equal to false. Now we didn't need a unique of true because, you know, people can have the same passwords. Okay, so now I'm also going to specify an REPR method, and that is a double underscore method, which people call dunder methods or magic methods. Now, if you don't know what this does, this specifically is how our object is printed whenever we print it out. So this and the double underscore str method as well. So we're just going to set this REPR one for now, and we'll see what this looks like in just a second. So I'm going to return what we want this to look like when we print out a user object. So I'm going to print out this term user, and then I'm going to put some parentheses here, and I'll just print out this user's username and email and image file. So I'll say self.username, and then I will copy this section here and then put a comma and print out the self.email, and then put a comma and print out the self.image file. And I won't print out the password for this user when we print out a user object. Now, if you're new to using classes in Python and would like to know more about the self variable that we have here and also these magic methods, then I do have a complete series on object-oriented programming in Python where I go over all of those concepts if this is something that is new to you. But I'm not going to go into detail about it here because really it does require its own series to go over. Okay, so now let's create the post class to hold our posts. So this is going to be similar to our user. So I'll just copy and paste this in here, but this will be for posts. And again, we're going to be inheriting from our db.model. And now we're going to create similar columns. So we want another ID column, which is going to be exactly the same. So I'll post that in there. Now we want a title, and a title is going to be a string column. So I'll copy this up to this point here and copy that and paste it in. Now let's say that we want the title to be a max of, let's say, 100 characters. And now we will say that we have to have a title for each of our posts. So nullable will be equal to false. Okay, so now we are going to want a date posted column to hold the date that our post was made. And this is going to be a DB column. And the type of this column is going to be a db.datetime. And each of our posts will have to have a date. So nullable again is going to be equal to false. And now we want a default for this as well. So if we don't actually specify a date for when our post was created, then we're just going to say that it was posted at the current time. And so to get the current time, we're going to have to import the datetime module. So I'm going to go to the top of our file here, and I will say from datetime import the datetime class and copy that. And now down here we can say that we want the default to be equal to datetime.utc now. Now I'm not going to put parentheses to actually run that function, or else we'd be saying that we want the default to be the current time right now. We don't want the parentheses there because we want to actually pass in that function as the argument and not the current time. And you always want to use UTC times when saving dates and times to a database so that they are consistent. Okay, and lastly, all of our posts are also going to have content. So we will say content is equal to, and this is going to be a DB column, and the type of this column is going to be db.text. And again, the content will be required for every post. So we say nullable is equal to false and save that. Now we'll be using an REPR for this class as well. So let's paste that in. And instead, this will be, we'll print this out as a post. And we want to print out the self.title, and we'll also print out the self.date posted so that we can see those values of each instance. And I will remove that user file. I'm not going to print out the content because the content could be extremely long. And if you're looping through posts and printing them all out, I just want a short description of that post, and the title and the date posted will be good enough. Okay, so one thing you may have noticed is that I haven't added the author to the post model yet. So the post model and the user model are going to have a relationship since users will author posts. So specifically, this is going to be called a one-to-many relationship because one user can have multiple posts, but a post can only have one author. And this is how we do this in SQLAlchemy. So we can say up in our users model here, I will create a post attribute and set this equal to, now this isn't going to be equal to a column, this is going to be equal to db.relationship. Oh, and I spelled that wrong, relationship, there we go. Okay, so now we're going to say that this has a relationship to our post model, pass that in as a string, and then we're going to specify a backref here, and we'll go over this in just a second. I'm going to set a backref equal to author, and then also pass in this lazy argument and set the lazy argument equal to true. Okay, so again, we're saying that our post attribute has a relationship to the post model. Now the backref is similar to adding another column to the post model. What the backref allows us to do is when we have a post, we can simply use this author attribute to get the user who created the post. And if that doesn't make sense yet, then we'll see this in action in just a bit. Now, the lazy argument just defines when SQLAlchemy loads the data from the database. So true means that SQLAlchemy will load the data as necessary in one go. So this is convenient because with this relationship, we'll be able to simply use this post attribute to get all of the posts created by an individual user. Now notice that this is a relationship and not a column. So if we were to actually look at our actual database structure in some kind of SQL client, we wouldn't see this post column here. This is actually just running an additional query in the background that will get all of the posts this user has created. Okay, so now to specify the user in the post model, we can add the user ID for the author. So if I come down here into our post model, then we are going to create an attribute called user ID, and we're going to set this equal to, and this will be a DB column. And this will be a db.integer because it's going to be the primary key of our user. And now we need to specify that this is a foreign key, which means that it has a relationship to our user model. So we're going to say db.foreign key, and then we specify what that is. So with a string, we can say user.id. Now it'll be required that each post has an author, so we're also going to pass in a nullable is equal to false as usual. Okay, so again, this is going to be the ID of the user who authored the post. Now it might be a little confusing because we're using an uppercase P here in the user model when we define the relationship with the post, but we're using a lowercase u for the user ID in the post model. And that is because in the user model, we're referencing the actual post class, and in the foreign key, we're actually referencing the table name and the column name, so it's lowercase. So the user model automatically has this table name set to lowercase user, and the post model will have a table name automatically set to lowercase post. Now, if you want to set your own table names, then you can set a specific table name attribute, but since our models are pretty simple, we'll just leave those as the default lowercase values. Oh, and one mistake that I see here that I made, you probably noticed this when I did it, but whenever I created this email, this is supposed to be email here, and I actually left that as username. So that should have been email, so sorry about that. Okay, so now that we have these database models that represent the structure of our database, we can now use those to create the database. So to do this, we're going to use the command line. So I'm going to open up my terminal here, and I've still got my virtual environment activated and am navigated to the project directory. So within here, I'm going to say Python, and you have to be within your project directory to get these imports to work. So now I'm going to say from Flask blog import db. So Flask blog is my application file, and db is the instance of our database that we created. So I'll import that. Now we didn't get any errors, but we did get this output from SQLAlchemy. Don't worry about that. It's just some information. So now we can actually create our database by saying db.create_all and use that create all method. So if I hit enter, you can see that we don't get any errors. So that should have created our database. Now, since we're using a SQLite database for now, this is actually going to be a file on our file system, and we set our database URI to be a file in the same directory as our application and called that site.db. So if we look at our project directory, then we can see that now we have a site.db file here in our project directory. Now, I know that might be a little hard for you to see in my sidebar, but I have a Finder window opened here with my project, and we can see that we have a site.db file here that was created. Okay, so now we have that database, but it's currently empty. Now, it's also easy to add data to our database using the command line. Now, we'll be using our application to add this data later, but let's go ahead and add a user and a post just so we can see how this works. So I will go back to the command line, and now I want to import those models. So I'll say from Flask blog import, and the name of our models was user and post. So let's import those. And now let's create an instance of our user. So I'm just going to call this user user1, and I will set this equal to our user class. And now I'm going to pass in all of the attributes that this needs. So it needs a username. So I'll just set that equal to Corey. And also I'll pass in an email. So for an email, I'll just say c@demo.com. And it also needs a password. So we'll say set a password equal to password for now. So we're setting a plain text password for this example, but we're going to be hashing these passwords when we do this through our application. Also notice that we didn't specify an ID or an image file for this user. So since the ID is our primary key, it will assign this user a unique ID automatically. And we have a default value for our image file. If you remember, if we don't provide that, then it will just get that value of default.jpg that we specified in our model. So now let's tell our database that we're going to want to add this user. So to add this user, we can just do a db.session.add, and we want to add that user1 that we just created. So if we run that, we can see we don't get any errors. Now that hasn't actually added the user to our database. We've just told it that we have a change that we want to make to our database. So we could have several changes at a time and add them like this. And then when we commit those changes, then it will make all those changes to the database at once. So for example, if I add another user here, so I'm going to call this user2, and I will set the username equal to John Doe and set the email to jd@demo.com, and we'll keep the password set to password. And now if I also add this user, so I'll add user2, now let's commit those changes to actually commit those to the database. So we can say db.session.commit. And now that those are committed, they should now actually be in the database. And SQLAlchemy makes querying the database extremely easy. So let's look at a couple of common queries. So if we want to just get all of the users, then we can simply say, and I'm going to clear my screen here, then we can simply say user.query.all to get all of our users. And we can see here that it returns a list of both users that were created. So here is our first and here is our second. Now, if we just wanted to get the first user, then we could access it from the list that was just returned, or we could use the first method that gives you the very first result. So I could say user.query.first, and if I run that, you can see that we just get that first user back. Now we can also filter the results by using the filter by method. So if we wanted to filter by usernames, then we could say, so user.query, and use this filter by method. And we could say that we want to filter by users who have a username equal to Corey. And then we can do a .all to return all of those results. And we can see that we just get a list of one user there with that matching username. Now, if there were multiple people with that same username, then that would return a list of all those, but that should never happen in our application since our username is unique. And we can use the first method here as well. So if we just grab that first result without it being in the list, then we can just do a .first there, and we can see that we just get that user with no list. Okay, so now let's look at this user that is getting returned. So I'm going to use that same query again, but I'm going to capture it in a variable. So I will say user is equal to user.query filter by username equals Corey.first. So if I hit enter, now our user is that user that was returned from that query. But now we should have access to some additional attributes. So I could say user.id, and we can see that that user has an ID of 1. Now we can actually perform queries using the ID as well. So we already saw user.query.all and user.query.first, but if we were to say user is equal to user.query.get, then this will fetch a user with a specific ID. So if I get a user with the ID of 1, which should be that same user, then we can see that we get that same user as a result. So now let's look at this user's post by saying user.post. And we can see that that returns an empty list because this user doesn't have any posts at the moment. Now remember what I said when we wrote our model. So let me bring this up just so we can see it here. So when we wrote the model, I said that the post attribute isn't actually a column itself. That is actually running an additional query on the post table that grabs any post from that user. So let's create some posts written by this user so that we can see what this looks like. So I'm going to go back to our command line. And now I'm going to clear our screen here again so that we have more room. Now we still have access to that user. So I still have that first user with a user ID of 1. So now let's create a post. So I'll say post_1 is equal to post. And now we need to pass in all of the values that a post needs. So it needs a title. So I can just do a title of blog 1. It also needs some content. So I'll set the content equal to first post content with an exclamation point, and then it needs an author, and the author is a user ID. So I'll say user ID is equal to our current user dot ID. So let's run that. And also notice that when we created this post, we didn't specify a date for this post. So if we remember from our model, we have a default date of UTC now. So it should populate the date with the current UTC time if we didn't provide anything, which we didn't. Okay, so now let's add one more post that is similar. So I will go up here and change the variable name. I'll change this to post 2. And we will set the title equal to blog 2, the content equal to second post content, and we will keep the user ID the same. Okay, now remember we've created these posts, but they're not added to our database yet. To add them to the database, we need to do a db session.add, and we can add post 1 and also add post 2, and then we can do a db session commit to commit both of those at the same time. Okay, so now that those posts are committed to the database, now let's look at this user's post again. So I'll say user.posts, and we can see that now this user has a list of 2 blog posts. And this result is just a list, so we can loop through these just like any other list. So I could say for post in user.post, and within this list, I will print out, or within this loop, I will print out the post.title. So if I run that, then you can see it loops through our user post and prints out both of the titles for that. Okay, so now let me get the first of these posts by actually querying the post table directly. So I'll say post is equal to post.query.first, like we've seen before. And if I look at that, then we can see that we got the first post. Then now we can get the ID of the user who created this post just by accessing that column. So I could do a post.user ID, and we can see that that user ID is equal to 1. So we got the right ID for the user who created this post, but in the post table, that's the only information about the user that we have. We might want more information about that author. Now, if we remember back to our model, if I open this up here, then the post relationship from our user model lets us not only access that user's post, but it also adds this backref of author to each post. And that's not an actual column down here in our post model, but it allows us to use that to access the user who created the post. So if I switch back here to the command line, then we can see what that backref does. So if I was to say post.author, which again isn't in our post model, but if I was to run that, then we can see that we get the entire user object that we can work with. So that's an extremely nice feature with SQLAlchemy. Okay, so now that we've added some sample data just to make sure that everything was working properly, now let's delete all of this data so that in the next video, we're starting from scratch with a nice new clean database. So this is easy to do. Just like we did with db.createAll before, this time we can simply say, and let me clear the screen here, we can simply say db.dropAll. And that drops all of our database tables and rows. So now to create those tables fresh one more time, then we can just create them again. So I'll say db.create_all and run that. And that should have recreated that database structure. And now if we query all of our users or posts, so I'll say user.query.all, then we can see that that returns an empty list, so that's good. And if we do the same for posts, so post.query.all, then we can see that that is an empty list too. So those are both empty. Okay, so I think that is going to do it for this video. We now have our database created and a way to add data to that database. And in the next video, we'll be restructuring our application to a package so that we can move these models into their own file and also learn about the other benefits of using packages as an application structure. But if anyone has any questions about what we covered in this video, then feel free to ask in the comment section below and I'll do my best to answer those. And if you enjoy these tutorials and would like to support them, then there are several ways you can do that. The easiest way is to simply like the video and give it a thumbs up. And also it's a huge help to share these videos with anyone who you think would find them useful. And if you have the means, you can contribute through Patreon, and there's a link to that page in the description section below. Be sure to subscribe for future videos, and thank you all for watching.